July, a very busy month on the baseball calendar. We've got the draft, we've got the All-Star festivities, and we've got the trade deadline. Well, I've got notes on all of those things coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast.
You are Locked On Orioles, your daily Baltimore Orioles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey there, Orioles fans. Today is Tuesday, July 16th, 2024, and welcome back into the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Connor Newcomb, and coming up on today's episode, we are going to look at some Orioles news and notes across the landscape from the last day or so. First, we'll start with a disappointing performance from Gunnar Henderson in the home run derby on Monday night, but why it wasn't necessarily all his fault. Then we'll talk about Corbin Burnes being named the American League starter for the All-Star game here on Tuesday night. We'll talk about some trade deadline stuff. We'll look through the AL East. There are two teams, the Blue Jays and the Rays, who could be sellers at the deadline. And we'll ask, would they really trade with the Orioles? And then finally, I'll get you the scouting reports on the Orioles' final 10 selections in rounds 11 through 20 of the 2024 MLB Draft. But that's all coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast, which is brought to you by Booking.com. Booking.yeah. The right stay can make you a fan of any city, even your rivals. So check out Booking.com for your stay today. So we'll start this one with, not what we wanted to probably see from Gunnar Henderson in the home run derby on Monday night. Now, it was just incredible to see him in the event. I got pretty lucky that he was hitting last, had a softball game at 8:30, was still able to win the game, come home, and still get to see his entire round. Unfortunately, he put up only 11 home runs. Now, with the new rules this year, everybody goes in the first round. The top 4 out of 8 home run totals advance. Gunnar hit 11. That was the lowest total. Now, Pete Alonso had 12. He had a really bad showing as well, and he was my favorite to win it because he takes this event seriously more than anyone. It is the first player ever to compete in 5 consecutive home run derbies. But for Gunnar Henderson, not the greatest showing in the world. Now, he owned the derby before it started with the Scooby-Doo bat and the Scooby-Doo impression when he went on ESPN to do that. That was just amazing stuff from Gunnar Henderson. But 11 homers was not good. It took him like 30, 40 seconds to even hit his first one, which was a tough watch. But I got to say, some of this is obviously on Gunnar Henderson. A good chunk of this is on Buck Britton, the Norfolk Tides manager in AAA in the Orioles system, who Gunnar picked to be his BP thrower in this home run derby. Britton, who had thrown him a lot of BP when Gunnar was down in AAA Norfolk back in 2022. And in terms of allowing your hitter to go yard, Buck Britton was throwing some of the worst BP I've ever seen. Now, to be fair, when Buck throws BP before AAA games, he's mixing things up. He's throwing high, low, inside. It's that high leverage BP that has been written about that the Orioles do in the minor leagues that really gets them ready for games. And that is, to be fair to him, what Britton is used to doing. He's not used to throwing it, laying it into one spot, trying to allow the hitter to go yard. Now, maybe it's a little on Gunnar for choosing Buck Britton. And I got to say, a pretty funny moment was when Buck Britton was announced. And I think someone had asked Zach Britton, who, of course, former Orioles closer, the younger brother of Buck Britton, how's his BP arm? And Zach Britton, probably in a funny way, just sent the thumbs down emoji. Well, after Buck Britton, it was rough. Zach Britton went in and deleted that tweet on Monday night. So it's all in good fun. It is what it is. It's the home run derby. It's not the end of the world if Gunnar Henderson finishes last in the derby, which he did. What are you going to do? It was a tough watch. Not only was Buck Britton not throwing it where Gunnar wanted it, like he was throwing balls. A lot of his pitches were out of the strike zone. It's hard to win the home run derby when your pitcher's throwing out of the strike zone. I'm sure there's, no difference in the relationship now between Britton and Henderson. But not the greatest day for Buck Britton and not the greatest day for Gunnar either, but hopefully he puts on a show in the All-Star game tonight. But speaking of that All-Star game, the Orioles now have 3 starters because we know they have 5 All-Stars overall, as Jordan Westburg and Anthony Santander were both added additions, with Kyle Tucker and Rafael Devers being injured. They will both be in their first All-Star games. They will not start the game, but 3 Orioles will. Gunnar Henderson, who was voted to start the game, will be in there. Adley Rutschman, who was also voted to start the game, will be in there too. And those two will be in the starting lineup playing catcher and shortstop for the American League. But the Orioles now have a third starter. And taking a look at that starting lineup, Gunnar will hit second and play shortstop. And then Adley Rutschman will hit eighth and catch against Paul Skeens, who will be the starter for the National League. But the starter for the American League will be Corbin Burnes, as that was named by Bruce Bochy on Monday. Bochy, who is the manager of the team because he managed the Rangers to the World Series last year. And what a cool moment for Corbin Burnes, who has been an all-star before, but he has never started the all-star game. And Bochy talked about how good he's been. He is second in the American League, slightly behind Tarek Skubal with his 2.43 ERA. He deserves it. 19 starts. He's thrown 119 innings, a 2.43 ERA. He's barely walked anyone, essentially. The strikeouts have been a little down, but it's allowed him to get deeper into games and pitch more innings. Already has 2.6 F-WAR at the break. He had a 3.4 WAR the entire season with Milwaukee last year. Burnes is putting together a fantastic year, a Cy Young contender. And at 29 years old, I think this is a very, very cool time for Burnes to get it. And Bochy basically said, hey, he's been one of the best pitchers in baseball over the last 5 seasons, and he's been an all-star, hasn't gotten to start a game. It was right up there. It was probably between him, Skubal, and maybe you could argue Seth Lugo was in that conversation as well to start the game. But very, very cool to see Burnes start it. I can't imagine he goes more than one inning. Burnes was not even in Texas on Monday. Of course, just a couple of weeks ago, his wife gave birth to twins, and he used the off day Monday to get home and help care for his twins. He may have even left the team Saturday or Sunday because he started Wednesday and then was done. So I wouldn't be surprised if the Orioles allowed him to leave early. I'm assuming he'll come back, pitch an inning, and then try to get back out to his family for the off days Wednesday and Thursday before presumably starting Friday to open up the second half back in Texas against the Rangers. But definitely cool to see Corbin Burnes on the mound. Orioles haven't had a pitcher start the All-Star game since Steve Stone did it in 1980. That is right, 1980. It has been 44 years since an Orioles starting pitcher was on the bump to begin the All-Star game. It is not something we've seen with the O's. We've seen a lot of starting hitters, certainly not a lot of starting pitchers. So going to be a cool moment for Burnes and all 5 of the Oriole All-Stars in the game here on Tuesday night. But this Oriole team, despite having 5 All-Stars and despite being in first place at the break, we do know they've got some flaws. And specifically, as the trade deadline comes up, it is now 2 weeks away. They're going to be looking for some pitching, both starting and relieving. And there are teams everywhere that could trade them some pitching, but there are probably 2 teams in the Rays and the Blue Jays in their own division who could be selling at the deadline. But the question always becomes, do you actually trade your players in division? And if you do, is it a higher price? Well, we're going to take a look at the players that the Blue Jays and the Rays could make available, and if the O's could add to their team from within their own division. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is brought to you by FanDuel. Now, I love sports. Love baseball the most, but just love sports in general, and they're always going on. But it does feel like here in the summer, especially during the All-Star break, we're in a little bit of a lull as, NBA and NHL are over, sports winding down. But no, don't look at it that way. There is still plenty going on. Even with the Euros and the Copa America over, we've still got Major League Baseball ramping back up this weekend, still have the WNBA, and oh yeah, the Olympics are still right around the corner. And this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right, there's something for everyone, every day, all summer long. So head over to FanDuel.com and start making the most out of your summer. At FanDuel, official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. And this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is also brought to you by Prize Picks, which for me is the most fun and exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. And America says that too. #1 daily fantasy sports app with over 5 million active members. It's super easy to play. All you do is go on the app and pick more or less on 2 to 6 player stat projections and just watch your winnings roll in. You can win up to 100 times your money with as little as 4 correct picks. You take a look at MLB or WNBA action coming up, and maybe it's more or less a certain amount of points for Caitlin Clark or Angel Reese, or more or less a certain amount of hits for Gunnar Henderson and Adley Rutschman. You just make the right picks, and you can win cash. So download the Prize Picks app today and use code LOCKEDONMLB for a first deposit match up to $100. That's code LOCKEDONMLB on Prize Picks for a deposit match up to $100. That's a Prize Picks. Pick more, pick less. It's that easy. So as crazy as it is to think, we are now 2 weeks away from the 2024 MLB trade deadline. Tuesday, July 30th at 4 p.m. Eastern time is your deadline. It's getting up there. And the Orioles, while a great team in first place, they're going to need to add at least a little bit of pitching, you would think. The hope is at least one starter and at least one reliever come to the Orioles at the deadline. And hopefully it's a little bit better than what they got in Jack Flaherty and Shintaro Fujinami at last year's deadline. And I've been doing a series here over the past couple of weeks on the podcast. And it will continue up to the deadline, where I'm looking around the league at basically every team that could be selling and identifying the starters and relievers that they could have to offer in a trade. And I've done it division by division. And for this one, we are going to go to the AL East. Now, this is where it gets a little bit tricky because this is the Orioles' own division. Now, there are two teams that could sell in the AL East. It's the Toronto Blue Jays and the Tampa Bay Rays. Now, for me, I really do think that Toronto is going to at least sell their rental players. It's been written about a couple of times. Ken Rosenthal's written a little bit about it, and others, Mark Feinsand, I believe, had a story about it on MLB.com that if they did sell, they would only trade their rentals. I really think the Blue Jays should. They're 44-52. They're 14 games back in the division. Like, yeah, they're out. They're also 9.5 games out of the wild card at the All-Star break. That is a selling team. And while they have the talent to certainly come back at it in 2025, which necessarily doesn't mean, they'll trade anybody who's going to be back next year, they have some rental talent who will be free agents after this year that they should be dealing away. Now, the big question is, would they trade to the Orioles, right? Would they send someone over there, even though it's a rental in their own division? And if they did, would they ask teams in their own division to pay a higher price because you're going to play them more? Now, there's a little bit less of that now than there was a couple of years ago because with the new balanced schedule, you only play the teams in your division 13 times a year instead of 19 times a year. So you just see those in-division opponents a little bit less. The Orioles still do have 2 more series against the Blue Jays this year, one in Baltimore and one up in Toronto. But if I'm the Jays, and again, if I am the Blue Jays, I am trying to get the best value out of trading my rentals. And if the Orioles are offering me the best package, I am trading them. And maybe it helps the O's like this as well. If you're only trading your rentals and you're saying, okay, we're already out of it, you're not trading a guy to your in-division opponent to beat you when it matters. For example, if they traded Yusei Kikuchi, a rental starter, to the Orioles, yeah, they'd have to probably face him down the stretch, but Kikuchi would then be a free agent after the year, and there's no guaranteeing at all that the Orioles would re-sign him, so he's really not hurting you when it matters. Now, if you traded someone like Chris Bassett, who has 2025 contract control as well, then you're going to be facing your own good player when you're trying to win again next year. That's the difference here, and I think that allows potentially this interdivision trade to happen here. So let's start with those 2 starting pitchers that I mentioned that the Blue Jays could be dealing. The rental who I think they certainly should trade is Yusei Kikuchi. Now, Kikuchi has had a good year, not a completely outstanding year, but I would say a really, really good year so far this season. He has been in this Blue Jays rotation all year, 20 starts, 106 innings, and he has a 4.42 ERA, but a 3.68 FIP and a 3.35 xFIP. He's been better than his stats show. 26% strikeout rate has been really good. 6% walk rate is also really low. You kind of like to see that. He's had a little bit of bad luck in terms of his BABIP and his fly ball rate as well. A few too many fly balls turning into home runs, and that's something that could be fixed for a left-hander when he comes to Oriole Park at Camden Yards. Now, he's owed, basically $4 million for the rest of the year. I mean, it would be a super cheap pickup for the Orioles as well. But for Kikuchi, he's had a little bit of struggles lately. Had a 6.26 ERA in the month of June, and his home runs went way up. But recently, 2 starts ago, had a career-high 13 strikeouts. Doesn't have like that elite strikeout pitch. That is the one thing, the one knock on Kikuchi. And despite a 26% strikeout rate, he doesn't have that pitch that's like, wow, he's going to go to that and it's just unhittable at times. It's more so of a kitchen sink mix, and he can strike you out with anything he has, four-seamer, curveball, slider, and changeup, but none of them are like gigantic whiff pitches. The changeup can be against right-handers, but generally doesn't have that crazy swing and miss pitch. But otherwise, he's had good command all year. It's good stuff. He would be a guy who the Orioles could get for, I mean, not cheap, because if we learned anything from the Hunter Harvey trade, kind of starting the merry-go-round of relievers, Hunter Harvey was traded from the Nationals to the Royals for a kind of, some would argue, fringe top 100 prospect and the 39th pick in this year's draft. Like, that was a big haul for Hunter Harvey. Even though Harvey has another year of control in 2025, the Royals gave up a lot. Pitching is going to cost a ton at the deadline. But for a rental in Kikuchi, maybe the Orioles wouldn't have to give up a crazy amount. And that's a guy who I think you could lock in to be your number 3 playoff starter behind Corbin Burnes and Grayson Rodriguez. He would certainly help you all year, but I would feel comfortable with him as the playoff starter. I would certainly be all over Yusei Kikuchi. Now, the other guy they could trade is Chris Bassett. He's having another good year. He is a free agent, not until after 2025. He's owed $22 million next year. He's had a good season, 3.52 ERA, 19 starts, 107 innings, a few more walks and a few less strikeouts than we're used to with Bassett. I just don't think they're going to trade him, probably because the reporting has all been they will trade their rentals. If he does, though, he throws 8 pitches. He's thrown over 180 innings each of the last 2 years, and he had a sub-2 ERA in the month of June. The Orioles should be all over Bassett as well if they deal him, but I think the Blue Jays would probably hold on to him. Now, going into the bullpen, the Blue Jays do have 4 guys I could see them trading, 2 rentals and 2 non-rentals. We'll start with the non-rentals because, again, it's not trending that way. The right-hander Chad Green is one of them. He will be a free agent after 2025. Chad Green has kind of filled in as their de facto closer lately because both Yimi García and Jordan Romano have been on the injured list. And in 26 innings this year, he does have a 2.08 ERA, but it's a 4.97 FIP. It's basically a lot of smoke and mirrors going on with Green. Now, the stuff is still good, and he's left on base every single inherited runner, which is good to see. But it concerns me that FIP is so high. And then the other guy is Genesis Cabrera, left-handed pitcher who's also a free agent after 2025. He's a guy who 36 and a third innings has a 3.72 ERA, but again has a FIP over 5, low strikeout rate, high walk rate, basically a worse version of CNL Perez is what he is. I would kind of stay away from him as well, and the Blue Jays may not trade him anyway. But they do have 2 intriguing rental relievers. And the first one is Yimi García. And Garcia is a guy who was just dominating the Orioles earlier this year when he has pitched in Baltimore a couple of different times. Now, Garcia could be coming back fairly soon to the Blue Jays, which is, to me, a great sign for him, a great sign for the Jays, and potentially a great sign for the Orioles, because it looks like Ben Nicholson-Smith, who covers the Blue Jays, reported that Garcia could be activated on Sunday coming out of the All-Star break, which would give him, 4 or 5 outings for teams to take a look before the trade deadline. Now, Garcia was rehabbing an elbow issue. He got pushed back in his rehab with some neck stiffness, but finally seems to be ready to go. And he's been dominating this year when he has been on the mound. 28 innings, a 2.57 ERA, 35% strikeout rate, just a 6% walk rate. It's a big-time fly ball pitcher, but that could be okay with the big wall at Camden Yards. His stuff is absolutely nasty. It's one of the best four-seam fastballs in baseball. I did my list a couple of weeks ago of my favorite rental relievers, and I put Garcia up there at number 2 on my rental reliever wish list. If he's healthy, if he does get activated Sunday and look healthy, the Orioles should be all over him. And the other guy that could be available is veteran right-hander Trevor Richards, who is also a rental. He's got one of the nastiest changeups in baseball. He throws it all the time. He can give you some length out of the bullpen, which is nice as well. He's already thrown 49 2/3 innings on the season, and that is with a 3.62 ERA. Good strikeout rate, walk rate a little high, but it's under 10%, so it's nothing terrible. He has gotten some batted ball luck, just a 176 BABIP against him this year, but he's a guy you wouldn't bring in to pitch the 8th or 9th, but I think Richards would really help shore up kind of the middle part of the Orioles bullpen, would probably be much, much, much cheaper than Yimi García, and I think someone the Orioles could target as well because he really gets lefties and righties out. because that changeup is such a weapon against left-handers. Now, the other team that could sell is the Tampa Bay Rays. Now, they're a little bit closer to contention. The Rays right now 48-48, right at 500 going into the All-Star break. They're 10 games out of the division lead, probably not in play there. They're also 5.5 games out of the wild card, so they're much more in it than the Blue Jays are, but still you kind of look at it and you're just like, really, are they really going to go for it? But the Rays seem like a team that could do both things. They could buy and sell because they're used to doing that every year anyway, and they're kind of in it, kind of not. And you know they're still going to try and reload and win in 2025. Now, the Rays have already made a trade. They dealt Aaron Savali over to the Brewers. He was going to be a free agent after 2025, so he wasn't just a rental. They would have had one more year of him. They actually acquired Savali at last year's deadline from the Guardians, but just wasn't having a good year, wasn't really working out. That maybe signaled a little bit that they could be sellers, but I don't think too much because Savali wasn't even that good this year. But if they did sell, there are 2 more starters who they could trade away. Both are free agents after 2025, which gives them another year of team control. And that is something the Orioles are going to be looking for as well, because you go into next year right now and your only 2 healthy pitchers that you're looking at that you feel really good about being in your rotation are Grayson Rodriguez and Dean Kramer, and then you could say, okay, maybe Cade Povich as well. Like, that's what the Orioles rotation looks like right now for opening day 2025. They're going to want to add some pitchers if they can who are not just rentals. Now, it's going to cost them, but they could be all over it. And the first guy is Zach Eflin. He is owed $18 million next year, and a guy who just throws strikes. He does not walk anyone and has a gigantic pitch mix. He throws 6 or 7 different pitches. And the other nice thing about him is he's just been consistent, like especially since he signed with the Rays. But even when he was in Philly later in his career with the Phillies, he was really good. 17 starts this year, 99 in third innings, 3.99 ERA, 3.65 FIP. Again, a 19% strikeout rate isn't anything crazy, but a 2% walk rate. He's basically got the best command of any starter in Major League Baseball, has some good ground ball rates at times. He's another guy who, is not going to start game 1, but if he started game 3 for the Orioles in a playoff series and joined their rotation next year, I'd love to have Zach Eflin. The other guy is Zach Littell, also a free agent after next year. It's his final year of arbitration, so he'll make $5-6 million probably, would be pretty cheap. Also just does not walk anyone, a 4% walk rate, strikes out a few more batters. His ERA is a little higher at 4.26, but he still had a good season. More of a fly ball pitcher. One of these guys the Rays brought in who was just like a reliever who they turned into a good starter somehow, but his numbers have gotten a little bit worse this year. I'm much more excited about Eflin, and I will tell you, Zach Littell has a 6.27 ERA since June 1st. So if it was one of these guys, I'd rather go Eflin. And then the Rays probably have a lot of relievers they'd be maybe willing to sell, but the 2 most prominent ones they could. The first one is the former Orioles Shawn Armstrong, the right-hander, is a rental this year. The issue with him is all of his stats have just become terrible. 41 innings. He's got a 5.98 ERA. The walks have gone up. He's given up some homers. His cutter used to be his best pitch. Now that thing is getting crushed. I'm good on Shawn Armstrong. And the other one is left-hander Colin Poche. Now, he's not a free agent until after next year, so you'd have a little more control of him. He did miss about a month with a back injury earlier this season. Poche's stats this year so far, 25 innings, 3.24 ERA, but a 4.96 FIP, about a league average strikeout and walk rate for the veteran left-hander. He's pitched in the AL East a lot. His slider used to be really good. It's kind of lost a lot of its nastiness. I'm kind of out on Poche as well. So really for the Rays, I'm only kind of targeting Zach Eflin if the Orioles can afford it. But in Toronto, if they can make a trade with the Blue Jays, you got a lot of nice pieces over there. Kikuchi, Jimmy Garcia, Trevor Richards, I'd be all over it to add to this Orioles pitching staff. But that's a look at who could be traded within the AL East. To finish off the pod, though, coming up next, final day of the 2024 draft was on Tuesday, rounds 11 through 20. Going to run through quickly some of the Orioles selections, give you a little scouting report on each one of them before we wrap up this episode. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is also brought to you by Booking.com. Booking.yeah. With summer travel heating up, especially for baseball games, it's time to explore the U.S. cities you've always secretly wanted to learn more about. Yes, we're talking about your rival cities. With hotels, bed and breakfast, vacation rentals, resorts, and so much more. at Booking.com, you might just find your perfect stay even in your baseball rival's city. Now, listen, there's some fans that I'm not a big fan of, but there's some places I'd like to go, and I still haven't been to Canada. The Orioles do go to Toronto August 6th through 8th, and Orioles and Blue Jays have developed some kind of rivalry over the past decade or so, and Toronto's a fun city, though. Even though I don't like Blue Jays fans, I don't particularly think I would like their stadium a lot, I would like to explore Toronto. So maybe that's somewhere where I could go in August, and I can do it through Booking.com. The right stay can make you a fan of any U.S. city, even your rivals. Book today on Booking.com, on the site, or in the Booking.com app. So to finish off today's episode, just want to run through the final group of selections the Orioles made in the 2024 MLB Draft. If you want to hear about all the picks from rounds 1 through 10, go back and check out Monday's episode. We had Darren Vaught on the show to talk about some of the Orioles' early selections. Now it's rounds 11 through 20. The draft is now 20 rounds, and we'll just kind of run through some of the names, or really all of the names, that the Orioles brought in on the final day of the draft, and a little nugget of info on each of them. Started with their 11th round pick. It is Sebastian Gongora. He is a 22-year-old left-handed pitcher out of Louisville. He will be 23 in September. Spent 2 years pitching at Wright State, one of the better mid-major programs in the country. Then transferred to Louisville this year. Fastball in the low 90s, but it tops out at 97. Has a great slider for swing and miss, and a curveball and a changeup as well. Joe Doyle, our favorite draft expert, called him, quote, said he has a big arrow up here with Gongora, means he thinks he's only going to get better, and was really good at Wright State. He was the 2023 Horizon League Pitcher of the Year. Now, his ERA went up at Louisville, which was a little bit concerning. Had a 6.14 ERA in 15 starts this year, but his strikeouts also went up to 25%, with his walk rate staying the same. So that's something the Orioles are certainly taking a look at, with the stuff getting better and the Ks going up at a bigger program for him. In round number 12, the Orioles went with their second high schooler of the draft, 17-year-old right-handed hitting catcher/outfielder Andrew Tess out of Calvary Christian High School in Florida. Pretty athletic, good defensive catcher with some offensive upside. Was not ranked in the top 15 by Joe Doyle, but is a commitment to play his college baseball at Pitt. So we'll see if the Orioles can get him to forego that and join the O's system. In the 13th round, they went back to pitching right-hander Brandon Downer, a 21-year-old righty out of Cal Baptist University, a program that just a couple of years ago moved from Division II up to Division I. Now, he was in the bullpen for a while, moved to the rotation this year, and his strikeouts did go down when he moved to the rotation. And that's something you kind of expect for most pitchers, right? You're pitching more innings. You're trying to get deeper into games. So your Ks do go down. That's not a super surprising thing that happens to anyone at the college level or at the big league level. He's a big 6'5" right-hander who is actually committed to Kansas as a transfer. So if he does not sign with the Orioles, he'll play for the Jayhawks. Also is not ranked in Joe Doyle's top 615 draft prospects, at least at the moment. But Downer, as a starter this year at Cal Baptist, a 4.35 ERA with 63 strikeouts and 32 walks in 82 2/3 innings of work for him on the season. Down to their 14th round pick, Cohen Aiken was the selection. Another right-handed pitcher, 4-year pitcher at Lindsey Wilson College. That is an NAIA program in Kentucky. NAIA is outside of the NCAA, usually a division below NCAA. He had a great career there, 3.66 ERA, over 11 Ks per nine in 4 years. Now, his ERA went up in his senior year. It was up to 4.90, but he struck out 101 batters in just 64 1/3 innings this year at Lindsey Wilson College. Was basically the best strikeout pitcher in the country when it comes to all of NAIA baseball. Went and played in the Northwoods League this summer. 37% strikeout rate and a 5% walk rate in the Northwoods League. Fastball low 90s, a sinker, a changeup, and a super sweepy slider. Also not ranked by Joe Doyle, but this is a guy who the Orioles see this strikeout stuff and maybe could pop up as a really interesting reliever fairly quickly because he is older in this system as well. In the 15th round, it's another pitcher, right-handed pitcher Carter Rustad, kind of an older guy, 23-year-old right-hander who has played 5 years of college baseball, pitched 2 years at the University of San Diego, then transferred and pitched for 3 years at Missouri in the SEC. Now, he did miss all of 2023 basically with an arm injury, but returned this year for Missouri, kind of half as a starter, half as a reliever. Now, he ended up not having the most amazing stats in the world, but that was because this year he had one terrible outing, his second to last outing of the year. He allowed 9 earned runs in 3 innings against Auburn, which ballooned his ERA up to 6.37, but he struck out 58 and walked only 10 batters in 65 innings for the Tigers this year, so that you know the Orioles are going to like that. Was also a high school pick in the draft all the way back in 2019 in the 23rd round, didn't sign and went to San Diego instead. And now 5 years later, he is drafted once again. In the 16th round, the Orioles go with a high school outfielder. It is Nate George out of Manuka Community High School in Illinois. Just turned 18, one of the younger players in the entire draft class. And Joe Doyle said he is built like a powder keg at 6 feet tall and 200 pounds, a right-handed hitter who is getting better out there in the outfield. But Doyle had a pretty interesting write-up about him and basically said he has a swing like Evan Gattis, if you remember him from the Astros, but runs really, really well, especially for his size, kind of like Gattis did as well. And George is number 317 on Doyle's board, which basically tells me if the Orioles saved any money going under slot with anyone in the first 2 days, they're probably going to have to throw some extra money to George to get him to sign. Now, there is not a big-time college program trying to pull him away. He is committed to Northwest Florida State College, which is one of the best junior college programs in the country, but it is a JUCO. And generally when you go to a JUCO, you are either trying to transfer a year after or trying to be eligible for the draft after your freshman year of college. So hopefully he is a guy who has his sights set on pro ball. The O's will have to offer him a little extra money anyway, but maybe he's a guy who really did want to get drafted. And our guy Joe Doyle seems to be pretty high on Nate George. In the 17th round, the Orioles go with another pitcher to add to this list. It is left-handed pitcher Isaiah Salinas, a freshman left-hander out of Cowley County Community College in Kansas, where he committed. It's a fastball in the low 80s up to 90, but a good curveball, changeup, and slider combination. In 62 innings this year at the JUCO level in his first college season, he struck out 90 batters, walked 37, and had a 4.21 ERA. Looks uncommitted in terms of transferring to a D1, so it might make him very signable. And Prep Baseball Report had him as the number 32 junior college prospect in the country in their midseason top 100 rankings. Was not ranked by Joe Doyle in his top 615 draft prospects, but seems like another under-the-radar guy picked up by the Orioles. Orioles went the pitching route once again in round number 18. Right-handed pitcher Michael Calden was the pick, a 4-year right-hander at a Felician College, a Division II school in New Jersey. 75 and a third innings in his final year there this year with 109 strikeouts to only 23 walks and a 3.58 ERA. Not ranked by Joe Doyle, and that is all I've got for a guy out of Felician University, maybe in D2. The Orioles did some serious scouting for this draft. In the 19th round, Braylon Whitaker was the selection, left-handed hitting outfielder out of Cox Mill High School in North Carolina, a high school pick. He is committed to Wingate. That is a Division II school, but a very, very strong Division II athletics program. Leadoff type hitter, plays a really good center field. And in his senior high school season this spring, hit 500 with a 619 on base and a 731 slugging, 25 walks to just 5 strikeouts in his senior year. And last, but certainly not least, the Orioles' final pick in the draft, 21st player that they selected. Their 20th round selection, pick 609, is right-handed pitcher Evan Yates out of Cal State Fullerton. So they took a couple of guys who theoretically were going to be in the Cal State Fullerton rotation this year. They took the right-hander Christian Rodriguez in the 10th round. Now, Rodriguez missed all of 2023 when he had Tommy John surgery, but returned this year. It was Yates who was pretty dominant in 2023. 3.75 ERA as their Saturday guy, 74 innings, 69 strikeouts, but he did not pitch for Fullerton in 2024. He was on the roster but did not pitch. Couldn't find anything about injury information. I would assume that was it, but it could have been something else. Either way, he has pitched this summer, pitching for the Frederick Keys in the MLB Draft League this summer, a 1.27 ERA and 19 strikeouts in 21 innings. Low 90s fastball, got a curveball, slider, and changeup to go with it. He was set up to be the ace, the Friday night starter for Cal State Fullerton this year, but something happened and did not pitch. So definitely has some good stuff and maybe could be a steal. He has another year of eligibility if he wants to go back to Fullerton, but hopefully the Orioles can sign him here at the end of this draft. But that is a wrap on the 2024 MLB Draft. The Orioles ended up taking 21 players, 17 college players, and 4 high school players. All 4 high school players were hitters. Again, the O's stay where they've been with not taking many high school pitchers, highest risk by far of any players. They took a pretty even split, 11 pitchers and 10 hitters of 21. Of the 10 hitters, 4 outfielders, 2 infielders, and 4 catchers. And of their pitchers, it was 8 righties and 3 lefties that they selected in this year's draft. That'll do it for today's episode. Hope you enjoy the All-Star game tonight. I will be back tomorrow, of course, recapping said All-Star game, what we see from Burnes, Rutschman, Henderson, Santander, and Westberg, and then continuing on with our coverage of maybe the draft, but even more so the trade deadline, which is less than 2 weeks away. That is coming up on tomorrow's episode. But until then, I'm Connor Newcomb, and this has been the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.